Since God took me on this incredibly challenging faith journey more than 6 years ago, we have always been blessed with a comfortable place to rest one way or another. God promised to be our home a long time ago and that He would support us. From His promise coming out and being tangible. There were nights when we stayed in low-rate hotels, and there were times when God put us up in the nicest Hilton hotels. There were times when God even put us in lavish city apartments that were like a resort, and a castle apartment that made me feel like I was living in a fairy tale. He promised to be our home, and it never failed. However, there was one night when I was not given an average seeming room, and it was so that God could teach me the spiritual laws that border between faith and fear. But before I get into that story, I want to give you a background of where I had fear. There was one memory or moment when we were living on this new journey in an unfamiliar state, when I left the hotel room in the morning to get something out of the car. When I got to the parking lot, I was so confused because I couldn't find my car anywhere. I couldn't understand what happened, and I was frantic. I thought it was stolen, but after one call to the police, I found out that it was repossessed for a few missed payments from going on this journey with Jesus. Thankfully, God sent me what I needed to get my car back, but it was the scariest time of my life. I was so afraid because the hotel was booking out, and if we had to leave our room, then we would have no way to go anywhere. We would have been stuck and stranded on the side of the road. That memory became a place where fear grew and festered like an infected wound. Because I've had to trust Jesus for every drop of what we need in very uncommon ways that go beyond my understanding. There were times when things were paid in unusual ways in undesirable times. There was a lot of pressure that I had to go through. And I had to trust Jesus with all of my heart. And it was hard to do that. I had to trust God's plans, and sometimes the hardest thing to do in my life was to trust beyond my own understanding. There was one night that was the worst of all. It was my lowest low ever. I had to learn an unforgettable lesson about trust. It was a night unlike anything I'd ever known in all these years of writing about depending on God's promise for this journey. When God asked me to follow Him through the aspen trees of promise to tangible hopes, which you can read more about that on my blog on diamondsfromthedust.com. There's a bunch of posts under the Faith Walk section of the blog. But I missed a massive key that I needed to survive, and that was trust. There's this little phrase that God always says to me, and that is, if you continue to make choices by fear, then you will continue to be controlled by doubt. And he who doubts shouldn't expect to have any answered prayers, because then we're double-minded. But for weeks after losing my car, I had been really fearful about losing my car like I did before. It was a security blanket for me, and my fear became such a powerful force that I started to follow fear instead of faith. I had been making choices out of fear instead of trusting God, and it was like a cancer that kept spreading and getting worse. It was consuming me. God had given me a very detailed promise about my car and how the situation would go, However, I let myself get carried away with the fear of losing it again or going through that same terrifying moment again, to the point where I was being paranoid and making super fearful choices every day about my car. There were so many devastating things that could happen if I did lose the vehicle, considering our situation, and I surrendered to those fears in my mind through little choices at a time. Those individual drops of fear-led choices added up to be a strong current, and they dragged me out into the stormy waters like a riptide. Instead of denying my fears and putting the vows that Jesus made me as the king of my life, I ended up playing in very dangerous waters. There was one morning where I sat in my car for 2 hours in the parking lot just trying to protect it, instead of trusting God's personal promise about the situation. God showed me that there was an invisible fence in the spiritual realm that was protecting us from getting hit by the ocean waves of this huge storm that's been against us. He showed me that because I was making choices by fear instead of trust, that I had gotten myself on the wrong side of the fence. I was no longer on the side of the fence that kept out the waves, because I had allowed my fears to lead me to the unprotected side of the fence, and I got hit by the waves of the storm. And wow, did I get hit. That day I had been in the car for 15 hours, in a constant battle of being double-minded between fear and faith. I was joyful with faith in what God promised us for a while, and then with sobbing, gut-wrenching fears of agony as I looked at the size of our troubles. I started to drown in fear and pain. And even through the chaos of my fears, God kept showing me RVs. So I was beginning to understand that we would have a vehicle-type bed for a little while. It wasn't until 1 a.m. that I gave up, and I drove to a travel gas station where they allowed drivers to rest for the night. I was so lost and in such shocking disappointment at that moment. I had never known a promise to fail in all these years. God has been always faithful to show up, and it was like I got smacked in the face with a wave of pain, of disappointment, of shock. And I've seen so many promises fulfilled, so I just couldn't understand what happened. And so I slept a few hours on and off, very uncomfortably, and in constant alert in that car. It was my rock bottom moment. It was like I was taken to the lowest ocean, to the very bedrock of it. It was so hard. I thought I was over with, and I hid my face as I wept deeply onto my shirt until my heart felt crushed beyond repair. And I didn't think I could ever rise up out of that pain ever again. I didn't think there was hope for me anymore. I thought this is the end. I thought God had left me. It was heartbreaking. And there was little space between the cars, so it was very awkward. I hid us under a blanket. I put a blanket over the window so we had a little privacy. And it just felt like I got hit with such an enormous wave of shock because I've never seen God fail me in all these years. My faith was broken. It was shattered. I was in unspeakable disbelief, and I was beyond heartbroken. My faith was shattered. and I fell asleep in a car with tears still pouring down my cheeks. As soon as I fell asleep, God showed up to comfort me, and He revealed to me what happened. He said that I was depending on fear and not Him, and that is when He showed me the fence vision. The promises of God do not prosper when mixed with unbelief and fear. Fear causes a blockage from us to be able to receive. I finally understood that I had allowed my fearful thinking to drag me over to the wrong side of the fence, where I was no longer protected. As soon as I understood my error, I repented for putting my faith in fear and not in God's promise to protect us, and the blockage was instantly cleared. I mean, it was only minutes, and I got a donation that allowed us to get a very cute little room for the night. God comforted me from my pain with $1,000 that came out of nowhere to cover our room and food for the week without having to walk through the pressures and pain that I had before. And I needed a lot of recovery time, so that was perfect. My faith has never been pressed like that before, and every last fear was being pushed out of me. When that relief came in, it was the greatest comfort in my life. To be able to stretch out on a bed and take a hot shower. Most people don't know this, but people that don't have homes, even parking lots, they don't allow you to park in parking lots. People get chased out of parking lots, and you're such an outcast. If you don't have a home, you're an outcast. You can't get a mail. You can't. There's just a million things you can't do, and it's so hard. And so I have such a passion for the future God's given me to build homes for people and refuge for His people. But in the city where God has taken us, every single place is expensive, and the room deposits are everywhere, and they're often the same cost of the room or even more. So surviving this has never looked more impossible. Yet just when I think I'm not going to last another day, God sweeps in like a raven to deliver us support to cover our needs. Sometimes He has me step out of my comfort zone in different ways, such as sharing these moments with you, but the rewards are always far more than the cost it took me to swallow my pride. Having a bed or a meal is more precious to me than gold now, because I've walked through this low valley, and I'm more empathetic to those who are walking through the misery, and it's going to make what I have to do in the future so much better, because I'll be able to carry these people's heart on my sleeve and love them the way Jesus loves. Those are things I never realized I would appreciate so much. After I learned my lesson, I made sure to change the way I would think and make choices. I had to practice putting every fear to death and choosing to trust God's promises no matter how hard or impossible it looks. The moment when God sent us the relief to get the hotel room, it was like a huge ton of bricks fell off my shoulders. Letting go of my fears is the most pain-relieving thing I've ever encountered. Trust gives us comfort. I no longer had to watch my back and live in fear of bad things that could happen. Instead, I was able to rest in the very details that God promised me regarding our home and car and this journey and my future. If I didn't have those promises and those prophetic plans revealed by God, I don't know how I would get through this. I'm thankful. I needed that. Those are my anchors. It's the best feeling to let go and let God's power keep His promise. I was keeping that power from protecting us by my own fearful resistance, and I hope to never find myself on the wrong side of that fence again. Thank you for listening to my story. I have so many stories like this on my blog, so I hope you'll come see me there. And also, I've written, before the journey I'm on now, I had a 3-year-long journey that was very much like this, but completely different. And I wrote the very raw, transparent details in my book. It's called Naked Wings, because it's about my transformation and being vulnerable to trust in God's promise for us. And that's on diamondsfromthedust.com. Much love to you, and I'm sending you hugs for whatever you're going through today. God bless.